So 6 was the number. I'd figured out that 6 was the exact amount of books I could fit under my arm without making it look deliberate, like I was trying too hard. And here I am, standing in my garage, staring at these stacks of my own books on this folding workbench. And I'm doing this high-stakes social math. Because, you see, 3 books just seem silly, It's not substantial. It says, I have a hobby. But 10's too much, 10 is a manifesto. 10 is the guy you don't want to get stuck talking to at a party. And how would I even get 10 books from my Subaru to the front door of this photo studio without people staring at me, without making a scene, without drawing attention to myself? This is how my brain works. I'm worried about the physics of carrying my own literary success. So 6, in my head at least, just feels right. I can set them down quietly. I can be the guy who just happens to have some books, And if the event goes south, something happens, I can just sneak out with those 6 books under one arm. No harm, no foul. And I felt like, to be honest, I was going in to sell some encyclopedias, like I was handing out samples. But I wasn't selling a history of the Aztec temples. I was selling part of my own soul. The event that I was going to was this APA critique. APA stands for American Photographic Artists, which, if you aren't in the industry, is a big official trade organization for people who shoot the billboards you see on the freeway and the spreads in the magazines. It's a club for the advertising guys, the commercial pros, the high-end editorial types. Well, I mean, at least it used to be that. Now it's has guys like me, the wannabes. And it was a typical beautiful sunny night here in San Diego. It was clear. A Wednesday night. And I was headed to this event on the outer edge of downtown, this photo studio. And it was a room full of these serious photographers whom I've never met, gathered to do something which, truthfully, I've never actually seen, right? They're going to show their work in book form, real books, personal photo projects. It was kind of weird. It was bizarre. It was quite the world I didn't recognize, a world without deadlines or clients or anyone asking about usage rights. And I got the 6 books inside. I got them from my Subaru through the front door to this front bookshelf. They're just leaning up against the wall, right next to other books. My book stood out a little bit, My book, if you haven't seen it, has this butter yellow spine. That's the color that I've given it, butter yellow. It has 330 pages of words about why I think this craft matters, about what it costs and whether any of this is actually worth it. And after I dropped my books off on this shelf, I just went in the back and just stared at them for a moment. I know this is going to sound a little weird, but if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you're used to that, I guess. I got this strange sense that my books were suddenly vulnerable. How weird is that? They were unsafe. I just dropped my kids off the playground and realized that I've forgot to give them lunch money. I wanted to go rescue them. And I watched other people walk up. They would set their own books down. And then my yellow spine would catch their eye. There'd be slight confusion as they would catch the title. There's a little intrigue, but they didn't linger. They just set their much thinner and glossier books down next to mine and went back to grab a beer. And bringing these books, bringing my books, felt, I'm going to admit, it's a little presumptuous, like showing up to a potluck with a cookbook that no one asked for and no actual casserole to share. And I sat there taking it all in. And my insecurity started doing the thing where it shifts into something else, A dickish part of my brain started to take over. Oh, cute, I thought. These guys are going to show their little photo book projects. I know. I'm a jerk. I'm owning it. And so I was second to last person to present. And I procrastinated signing up. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go at all. So I was just an add-on. I emailed the director. Her name is Wendy. Very kind. I emailed her and I asked her if I could present my book. Like I was a kid asking for an extension on a paper. And being second to last meant that I had to sit there with my own assumptions while the people who came before me proceeded to, they took me completely apart. And I sat off to the side, near the back against the wall. It was a small studio, low ceilings. I always judge photo studios by the height of their ceilings. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what this says about me, but I do it. I watched them fumble with the Apple TV. It happens every time. Airplay, I guess, is a natural enemy of the creative professional. I had this impulse to help. I always do, but I didn't want to be that guy. So I just sat there sipping my Starbucks. Truthfully, I didn't even want the coffee. I just needed something to hold, a comfort object. If you know, you know. And finally, they got it to work. And before the first slide came up from the first presenter, I caught a glimpse of her screen. And I noticed that she had probably 25, 30 slides in her deck. And I sat back and I rolled my eyes and I did the math. Great, I think. Here we go. And then the title page disappeared. The first image was of this little Irish girl standing against this vibrant blue wall. She had bright red hair and freckles so thick you could feel almost the texture of her skin. She was holding this corgi mix dog, grasping it tight in her arms. And she was just staring into the lens intensely with these intense Irish eyes. And I could see my own daughter in those eyes, And suddenly I'm just sitting there, bathed in the blue light from this television. And everyone in the room is just locked in on this image. And I thought to myself, oh, fuck. I read this whole thing wrong. I lowered the cup from my face and leaned forward. This was something more complicated. And I had no idea that by the end of the night, I was going to be what I felt like to be the least accomplished photographer in that room, or that it would feel like the best thing that happened to me in maybe a long time. Well, my name is Patrick Foyer, and this is The Terrible Creative, where we have honest conversations about creativity, identity, and finding your voice. Today, my friends, episode 61. I'm calling this episode Obsessed. Today, we're talking about three things. We're talking about substance, and cost, and voice. This episode lives somewhere between the question you ask about other people's work and the question you're afraid to ask about your own work. And look, I don't have a clean answer as usual, but I've been sitting with this for long enough now to know that it's worth to say out loud. If this is your first episode, welcome. Feel free to jump around. They're generally in no particular order. My email is in the show notes. Email me with any questions or thoughts or hate mail. I try to respond to everything in a timely manner. So, with all that being said, let's get into it. Her name was Michele Zousmer. Michele is a documentary photographer based in Southern California. And what she presented that night wasn't a project in the way that most photographers use that word. A project in the photography world usually just means a personal shoot, something that you did for yourself between client jobs, a weekend in the desert, a series of portraits of your friends, maybe. What Michele brought was something different. The Irish Travelers are a nomadic ethnic group, mostly in Ireland and in the UK. They're marginalized. They're misunderstood. The kind of community that doesn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for photographers showing up with cameras and, quote, good intentions. But Michele didn't just show up and shoot. Michele went back again and again. She sat in their spaces. She drank tea and waited. She spent considerable time earning the right to be in the room before she ever raised her camera. Lengths of time of nothing postable. Nothing that would perform well on a Tuesday morning. Just the slow, unglamorous work of being present enough, long enough, that people stopped performing for you and just started living. The result was that little girl against the blue wall holding her dog, staring straight into the lens with those eyes. Not posing, but more trusting. You can't manufacture that, You can't replicate it with better gear or a faster turnaround. It exists because Michele was willing to do the boring part, the long part, the part that the algorithm hates, the years before the image. And I just sat there in the back of that room thinking about my own workflow, You book the job, you scout the location, you have pre-production meetings, you show up and you shoot and you deliver and you get paid and you move on. But Michele didn't move on. And I think that's the whole point here. And then there was a guy named Andrew. He was next. Andrew was pretty chill. He's a clean-cut guy. Looks like he probably works in finance. I liked Andrew. Andrew spent the first probably 15, 30 seconds apologizing for the color accuracy of the display mounted on the studio wall. How the whites weren't the right white. I had respect for that, as a fellow technician. His work, it was like simple winter landscapes, a lot of negative space, contrasted by bare trees against gray skies. It was calming. It was clean. It was the opposite of Michele, Andrew's work was the kind of work that needed a Sigur Rós soundtrack behind it. His work was weirdly personal. I think his voice came through completely when I saw his work. He mentioned when he was presenting that he had OCD almost in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek manner, almost like an afterthought, which when I look at his work, I felt like it was medicine for his brain. It was almost medicine for my brain, just looking at it. One of his last images, though, was one of, I think, the best images that I remember from that night. It was a simple fox sitting in the snow, a scene just bathed in shades of white, staring at a bare tree, at the right edge of the frame, just cropped. It was beautifully composed. It was stunning. In my mind, it was a truly perfect image. I pride myself in trying to find some sort of note on people's images, and I had no notes. It was perfect, which is something I haven't said about very many images in my life. And it came from a guy who looked like he worked in an office, you know? Probably like a middle manager somewhere. I have no idea. This guy just shooting landscapes, a genre that, quite frankly, I don't really care much about. And I sat there in that bright glow of that studio TV mounted against the wall, staring at this fox and his tree in this perfect winter landscape. And I don't think I was just looking at a great photo. I think I was looking at a symptom, you know, a visible mark left behind by a very specific kind of fever. You see, Michele didn't just stumble onto the Irish travelers. She got pulled in and couldn't stop. She went back, she stayed with them, she earned her place into their lives before she ever raised the camera. Years of work that couldn't be posed, couldn't be monetized, couldn't be explained in a simple caption. Andrew has OCD. His brain won't let him not make that particular work. The stillness, the negative space, the single element against the silence. That fox in the snow wasn't a lucky frame. It was inevitable. It was always going to look exactly like that. Two photographers, two completely different kinds of work, but the same thing underneath. They found something that they couldn't put down and followed it past the point of convenience, past the point where a reasonable person would have moved on to the next thing. And most of the work that I see every day doesn't have that. And it's not because photographers aren't talented. It's because they haven't done the uncomfortable interior work of figuring out what to be obsessed with. So they borrow someone else's obsession instead. They replicate the output without the thing that produced it. It's spray painting aluminum and calling it rare. And listen, I'm in this too. My own portfolio, I know which images are the gold, the rare metals, and which ones are just painted to look that way. Even if nobody else notices, the difference is glaring to me. The painted ones are clear, clean. They're technically accomplished. They get likes. They even get work. But the real ones come from a place that I can't quite explain. And that's the gap. That's the difference between feeding off of someone else's fire and doing the miserable, boring, rewarding, challenging work of starting your own. And watching Michele and Andrew's work on that display in that photo studio on that Wednesday night, the question wasn't whether I admired what they had accomplished, what they produced. I did. It was whether I was actually going to pay the same price. The work that I see most days scrolling on Instagram everywhere is decent. It's competent. It's technically good. But when I look at it, I always end up in the same place sometimes. What is this for? Not loud, not usually, but the few times that I've said it out loud to photographers, I sound like an asshole, which maybe, I guess. But I feel like it's still a legitimate question, you know? And the fact that it's uncomfortable doesn't make it any less so. What is it for? Why does this image exist? This is a filter that I'm always trying to view my images through. And I will say this, the algorithm doesn't help, right? The work that services to our phones, the work that gets rewarded, the work that I scroll past every morning on my phone over coffee, it's mostly just borrowed obsession. Someone else's years of uncomfortable interior work replicated and posted and performing adequately. And that's the water. That's the water that I've been swimming in long enough to know that I've stopped noticing what it was doing to my eye. And I think this matters here because most of photography in 2026, I'm just going to be really honest here, all right? It's just photographers copying other photographers. It's gear forward, designed to stop the scroll. Cheap knockoffs of work that most of the time the photographers who made the work don't even know that they're knocking off. Carbon copies of carbon copies of carbon copies of other photographers' obsessions. And so there's me sitting in that metal chair on a Wednesday night in that photo studio, staring at these portraits and these images of documenting the life of these Irish travelers. And I was pulled in, immediately pulled in. I think that's what obsession does, which is why I walked in to that studio expecting more of the same, spray painted aluminum cans that people wanted me to be impressed by. But I walked out having learned something. Not just about the Irish travelers or Japanese winters, but that photography isn't dead. That it's more than a utility of headshots and product photos. That this work that we do can mean something. If we allow ourselves to be obsessed with something.
The other day, I heard this rumor that one of the best ways to draw consistently is to fixate on something and draw that thing obsessively. Now, I'm no stranger to hyperfixation. The reason I didn't watch anime for many years, despite my interest, was because I didn't have time to be obsessed with anything beyond the things I was already obsessed with. I've spent most of my teenage and adult life trying to overcome obsessions with books, TV shows, movies, games, etc. And for the first time in my life, at 27, I have a good reason to obsess over something. But as it happens, there's nothing that I'm currently obsessed with. So I've been digging through the archives, thinking about what old flame that I might be able to reignite. There's some easy ones. Kaya, Star Wars. I could go way back. Twilight, Harry Potter, Omori, Studio Ghibli. I need to dig deeper. Avatar. Not the Airbenders, unfortunately. Frogs, when I was a kid. Breaking Bad. Oh. I got something. Wait, it's on the tip of my brain. Something that I've suppressed. It has something to do with fairies. Or magic. Peter Pan. The live action Peter Pan shot me into my first ever emotional crisis, realizing that I could never be part of that universe. And that I was never going to be able to fly to Neverland. Did I have a crush on Peter Pan? Let's not I need to watch more CapCut edits and see which one hits the hardest. I really liked Kylo Ren. I really liked Kylo Ren. I just need to figure out how to reactivate an obsession. I need to get there. So, to TikTok we go. Maybe I should let my For You page decide. No, I can't. It has to be real. It has to be, Fixation so visceral, mentally and emotionally overwhelming that I just can't bear to keep it inside, and I have to spit it out. It has to be, I think, a person, a character, and it has to be in a universe that I want to live in or want to experience that I can't. I need that, forlorn and insatiable longing that will turn into art. I think I can get back to my First Order Kylo Ren interest. Maybe I need to watch The Force Awakens again. Call it professional development.
Look how old you've become.
Something far worse has happened to you.
You know what I've come for.
I know where you come from. Before you called yourself Kylo Ren.
The map to Skywalker. We know you found it.
Oh yeah. It's still in there.
So I want to get in the time machine. I want to go back to the height of the pandemic, where everyone had a whole lot of nothing to do. And it's a Monday night, and I'm in my backyard. It's a little bit past midnight. And I'm sitting on a patio table. Let me just say this, perfect San Diego night, Full moon that's just making this giant palm tree above me glow in this grayish blue light. And I have my second gin and tonic in my hand. I'm nursing it. And my iPhone is pressed firmly against my ear. And on the other end is a guy named Alex. Alex is a photographer out of New York. And Alex is a guy I've talked to enough to call a friend-ish. But during this time, we had this fundamental disagreement, to say the least. You see, Alex saw photography purely as an art form, first and foremost. Everything else beyond that is secondary. And at that time, I disagreed with this loudly. At that time, I was very much in the trenches of my corporate job. I was a lead photographer for a guitar manufacturer based in San Diego. And I was sitting there scrolling through my work on my laptop, sharing my screen, just basically showing off. I was showing him these big campaigns, high-end portraits, work that I thought was, clean, controlled, commercial. The kind that work that doesn't just get you one check, it gets you multiple checks. It gets you hired again. And then there's a long pause. And finally, this motherfucker, Alex, says, Patrick, you're not really an artist. You're more of a technician. And of course, in that moment, I don't know if it was a gin talking or the pandemic talking, but I got a little defensive, to say the least. And I spent the next 20 minutes building a case for myself. I'm listing clients. I'm talking about magazine covers, Grammy-winning artists. I'm laying out my resume like it's just a big, giant shield. And Alex is not really impressed. He just sort of lets me finish. And then he says, let me ask you a question, Patrick. Would 10 people look at these and say, oh, that work, that's Patrick for? Or would they just say, that's just good commercial photography? I told him to fuck all the way off. And then I hung up. It's not my best moment. I'm not proud of that moment, but I'm just telling you the story. And I thought about that question for a while. Didn't go away. Because that's the thing about that. A question like that, it doesn't go away. Just because you stop talking. That night, I leaned back in my chair. I looked up at the clear San Diego sky. And I proceeded to spend a long time trying to convince myself that he was wrong. And for a while I did, I had this argument in my head and I was winning. I was litigating my case with precision. The thing is, I think in the back of my head, and I know in the back of my head, I knew, sitting at this table, my gin going warm, I knew exactly how every image in my portfolio had gotten made. I had studied the best commercial photographers in the world. Not their vision, not what drove them, not what they were trying to say or their philosophy, but what they did, how they lit it, and how they composed it. And then I just replicated it. Voice to me at that time wasn't a concept that I rejected. It just was a concept that seemed like what people said when the work couldn't compete technically, the artistic evolution speech, the pretentious eye roll dressed up as depth. Quality for me was the standard, and my quality was high. Case closed. Except Alex's question didn't ask about quality. It asked about identity. And I didn't have an answer because I had never needed one. Before that shoot, good had a definition, Apple had it, Nike had it, Mercedes had it, the top commercial photographers in the world had it. And my job was to meet that standard, match it, get close as possible, close enough. And my own opinion of what was good was beside the point. I didn't answer Alex's question that night. I just closed the call and told him to fuck off, and I stared at the sky. But I couldn't stop thinking about that question. I couldn't stop thinking about that question when I would look at my own portfolio, when I would stare into my own work. It haunted me. A few weeks later, I found myself in the San Diego Downtown Library. And I was sitting in the art section, in the photography section specifically. I just pulled these books off of the shelf. And these weren't technique books, not lighting manuals, just work by famous photographers. And somewhere between Helmut Newton and a monograph I couldn't pronounce, I fell into this post-Soviet Eastern European editorial fashion photography, like women on iron balconies, barefoot, smoking cigarettes, defiant, not posing for anyone, daring you to look and not giving a shit if you didn't. It felt like power without permission. I was obsessed with this work. So I booked a shoot with no client, no brief, no pitch deck. I found this vintage feeling San Diego apartment. And I was particularly drawn to this bathroom that looked like just this 1957 French film. There was no technology in this space at all, right? There's no TVs or computers. It was just super classic. And in that bathroom, for the first time, it was weird that I was in a bathroom. The story's kind of weird saying it out loud, but I was in that bathroom for the first time. I was the only person in the room whose opinion counted. I wasn't shooting for Apple or a creative director or an art director or my company. It wasn't for the algorithm or my photography friends. I pressed the shutter on my camera and I thought it was good. I thought it was really good. And that was enough. And most people, I will admit, didn't really care about the images, from my perspective at least. But I did. I loved those images. And then slowly, without noticing, I just sort of drifted back into the water. The water is comfortable, you know, and that's the problem, because in the water, you know exactly what a good photo looks like. It looks like the mood board the agency sent over. It looks like the lighting setup you use 1,000 times because it always worked. The water is the safety of the high production value. When you're a technician, you can hide behind the gear. You can hide behind the latest Canon or Sony or the Pro Photo lights. If the image is sharp and the color is right, your job is done. But the water also washes away your fingerprints. It smooths everything out until everything is just perfectly sellable and completely anonymous. I was the second to last to present my book, which meant that I had the whole night to sit staring at those 6 copies of my book stacked against that wall. Butter yellow spine, 330 pages. That's about 80,000 words. Most of them written between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. while my family was asleep and the house felt like a tomb. And I will admit, there were months where I hated that book, where I never worked on it once, where the sight of that Google Doc made me nauseous because it felt like a monument to my own pretension. Who was I to write this? You know? That's the terrible part of the creative process people skip over in the montage. It's not a spark. It's the slow, agonizing crawl through a tunnel you weren't even sure has an exit. You don't write 80,000 words because you're inspired. You do it because the obsession won't let you sleep until the words are out. And this book, the thing about finding your voice, building a career, trying to leave a legacy, it was the book that nobody asked me to write. And I rewrote that stupid thing probably 12 times. I killed 7 chapters and 200 pages just to keep it from collapsing under its own weight. And I watched people walk past that book, glance at it and move on. And I sat there thinking about my friend Alex, about Apple and Nike, about the bathroom in San Diego. I thought about how long it took me to write just one sentence sometimes that actually felt like it was mine. And then I thought about the question I kept asking about other people's work. The one that makes me sound like an asshole, you know, the one that I wrote a whole book to answer. Who is this for? Why does it exist? And I realized I hadn't asked that about my own book. Not really. Not until that night. And when it was my turn to stand up and to present, I talked about why I wrote it. That I looked everywhere for a book about the hard parts of this craft, the failures, the fuck-ups, the slow erosion of your own voice under the weight of other people's definitions of good. I couldn't find it, so I wrote it. And then I pointed at the images spread out across this table in front of me. Michele's Irish Travelers, Andrew's Fox in the Snow. And I said that their work gave me hope. That as a commercial photographer who spends most of his time watching people make money with a camera, seeing work made simply because someone believed it should exist, that was something. That photography wasn't dying. That it was more than a utility. That the craft was fine. That rooms like the one we were all standing in was proof. And I'm sure people thought I was fucking nuts. But I said it anyway. And at the end of the night, people started picking up those books. one after the other. A few asked what they owed me. I said nothing, that it was my gift. I drove home empty-handed. Those 6 books were gone. Not because I had figured anything out, but because for one night, I knew what the gold looked like. Tomorrow, the water would start rising again. It always does. But tonight, I knew the difference. Well, until next week, stay obsessed, stay courageous, stay curious, and yeah, stay terrible.